I've always been quite fond of this stuff, known here in the United Kingdom as brown sauce. That got me to wondering how exactly it came about, where did it come from originally, how long has it been around for, and when did we start calling it brown sauce? First of all, what actually is brown sauce? HP sauce is by far the most well-known brand, but it's not the only contender. Others in the category include Daddies and some historical examples less seen on these shores today, like chef sauce, OK sauce, and A1 sauce. We'll come back to those later. I assume most people here in the UK have at least had HP sauce at some point, and a bit like Marmite, it divides opinion. It's often eaten with things like sausages and bacon. For many people, it's a classic accompaniment to a full English breakfast, and it's a mainstay of greasy spoons. It is, in some ways, at least a bit similar to ketchup, certainly in terms of consistency, and like ketchup, it has a flavour profile which is both sweet and sour. But brown sauce is more strongly flavoured, more savoury, tangier, spicier, and of course, rather than being red, it's brown. To people who don't like it, it's astringent, even acrid, and an assault on the taste buds. The ingredients in brown sauce vary quite considerably from one brand to another. Let's take a look at the ingredients of market leader HP sauce. The key things there are tomatoes, vinegar, sugar, I'm including the molasses in that, dates, spices, and flour for thickening. That all-important brown colour comes primarily from the molasses, but also the dates and the malt vinegar likely add to that. A few things there are potentially left obscure: spices and flavourings. At least some of those ingredients sound a bit similar to tomato ketchup, don't they? If we take Heinz, for example, as before, the first three ingredients are essentially tomatoes, vinegar, and sugar. So is brown sauce just brown ketchup? Well, no, not really. HP sauce happens to lead with tomatoes as its first ingredient, but let's take a look at Daddies, probably the second most well-known brand of brown sauce in the UK. No tomatoes there at all. We do at least have vinegar, molasses, dates, similar flour for thickening, and again those unspecified spices and flavourings. The vinegar is a bit different, with spirit listed first and malt listed further down the list. So can we at least say vinegar, some of which is malt, molasses, dates, and spices are the core ingredients of a brown sauce? Taking a survey of the big 7 UK supermarket own brand brown sauces, tomatoes. All 7 contain tomato puree or concentrate, but it's not always the first item in the ingredients. Vinegar. 6 of the 7 contain malt vinegar, Tesco being the outlier, which instead uses a mixture of spirit and cider vinegar. Molasses or sugar. 6 of the 7 use molasses, the one outlier here being Waitrose, just sugar. Dates. 5 of the 7 use dates. The 2 that don't seem to use apples and oranges instead. Tamarind. 5 of the 7 list tamarind in the ingredients. The 2 that don't are Asda and Waitrose. Spices. 5 of the 7, all but Tesco and Morrison's, actually list the individual spices. All 5 of those use ginger, cloves, and black pepper. Some others also use nutmeg, cayenne, and allspice. And for thickener, all 7 use modified maize starch. So I think the key takeaway from all of that is that there are no real essential ingredients to make a brown sauce. There's certainly a flavour profile, a consistency, and of course the colour, but as we've seen, all of those things can be achieved in different ways. Broadly speaking, supermarket own brand products tend to try and imitate the market leader, in this case HP. So although looking at those products tells us a number of different ways to achieve a roughly similar flavour to HP, it doesn't necessarily give us the full picture of what brown sauce is. And I think to do that, we need to go back and look at the history of brown sauce and the products which defined it. First of all, it's important to say that although sauces we now consider to be brown sauce were first created in the 19th century, that term probably wasn't used to describe them until well into the 20th century. In fact, I don't think it was until sometime after World War II. The foundations of British brown sauce lie in 3 or possibly 4 products, which I think developed more or less independently of each other, but happened to be variations on a similar theme, and were all, most importantly, brown. Curiously, 3 of them also had 2-letter names: A1, OK, and HP. Alright, strictly speaking, 1 isn't a letter, but you know what I mean. Let's take a look at A1 sauce first. A1 sauce is probably more familiar to anyone watching in North America or Southeast Asia than it is today for anyone here in Britain. However, it originated here in Britain and was quite possibly the first brown sauce. Let's take a look at the ingredients of this modern American incarnation here to see if it fits the pattern. It's a bit different from typical British brown sauce, but you can kind of see how it's related. Instead of the dates here, we have raisin paste and orange puree, but the tomato will also contribute to the fruity flavour. An unspecified type of vinegar for our sour component, corn syrup for the sweet component, and again some unspecified spices there. Xanthan gum used to thicken here, and some caramel for colour, as we saw previously for other brown sauces which didn't use molasses. However, for the modern British incarnation, which is still manufactured here, but you can only buy, I believe, in parts of the world like Singapore and Malaysia, the ingredients list look a lot closer to, say, HP. We have the malt vinegar and the dates. The spice mixture is familiar from all those supermarket clones: ginger, nutmeg, black pepper, cayenne. The two major differences are there's no molasses, it's all sugar, so correspondingly there's some caramel to help the colour. And to thicken, instead of the rye flour and corn flour as used in HP, we have carob bean gum. So there are actually 2 A1 sauces in the world today, and they both share a common history. There are claims that the origins of A1 sauce go back to 1824, when its inventor, Henderson William Brand, who lived from 1805 to 1893, served it to King George IV, who then declared it A1. An advertising campaign of around 1906 illustrates this. The part of that relating to the monarch coining the name is perhaps to be taken with a pinch of salt. Whether directly or indirectly via George IV, the term almost certainly derives from the Lloyd's Register, and they used it to denote a first-rate ship for insurance purposes. I think this became adopted in the 19th century as a more widespread term for anything which claimed to be the best in its class. Henderson William Brand certainly was a cook to George IV, and later in life wrote cookbooks such as a revised edition of Simpson's Cookery. And of particular note is a book he wrote titled The Modern Process for the Preservation of All Alimentary Substances in 1838. That contains a description for how to make, bottle and preserve things like tomato puree and concentrated soup. Although there is no specific recipe for or mention of A1 sauce at that time, he was definitely thinking about this sort of thing around then. The earliest written reference I found to A1 sauce is in an advert of 1872, which seems to be referring to the Great International Exhibition of London in 1862 and the 1867 Paris Exposition, possibly suggesting where and when the sauce was first introduced to the world. That advert refers back to that H.W. Brand, who was still alive at that time. I found Henderson William Brand in the 1871 census, and he seems to be living next door to the manufactory from that earlier advert where the sauce is made on Villa Road in Brixton. His occupation is entered as culinary chemist. I bet there weren't a lot of those around at that time. A similar but slightly more elaborate advert appears in 1873 and lists much of Mr. Brand's resume, including that he was co-manager of the cuisine at the Great International Exhibition of 1862. In these adverts, the product seems to be sometimes referred to as Brand's International Sauce, and that was perhaps a bit of foresight that ultimately it would become more popular overseas than here in the UK. Here's an 1889 advert. Note the specialities or specialties for invalids, which we'll come back to later. Our American cousins developed a taste for it, and drinks company Herbline were initially the sole importers to the US for Brand & Co.'s A1 sauce, as noted here in this advert of 1895. However, here things get a bit confusing. A year later, in 1896, an advert lists Mason's A1 sauce, made in London. I particularly like this advert in 1898 for Mason's A1 sauce with the slogan, "Makes eating a pleasure and life worth living." So we seem to have 2 competing A1 sauces in America in the 1890s, Brand's and Mason's. It was around this time that Herbline & Co. filed a trademark, presumably motivated to do so by this competing product. According to the United States Patent and Trademark Office, the exact trademark registered in 1895 was the A1 International Sauce. I don't know if that trademark would have been enough to stop another company selling a product simply called A1 sauce if it didn't also have the word international in it. And in 1907 we hear that the New York premises of the manufacturer of Mason's A1 sauce had burned down. There we get the full name of the company, George Mason & Co., and we'll be encountering them again later. Mason's A1 sauce was still being sold in parts of the US as late as 1919. It's not clear whether Mason's A1 sauce just petered out as a brand or whether there was some litigation involved to get them to stop selling it, but eventually Herbline started selling A1 sauce under their own name. Here's an advert from 1915. Through a series of mergers and acquisitions, Herbline's brands ended up being owned by Kraft Heinz, and A1 sauce remains popular in the US today, apparently a fixture in almost every steakhouse in the country. Here in the UK though, sales went into decline in the 20th century, and by the 1970s it had practically disappeared from supermarket shelves. However, as noted earlier, a British version is still manufactured for export to Asia. It's actually still called Brand's A1 sauce. It's a bit different from the American version, but I suspect this one is closer to the original recipe. Next, let's have a look at OK sauce. There are clear parallels with the names of this product and of A1, and seemingly much overlap between these two companies as well. Today there's something quite funny about the name OK sauce because of that odd phenomenon of linguistic inflation. Words which originally had quite a strong positive connotation eventually gravitate towards mediocrity. The same thing applies to alright. OK is a word we've of course imported from American English, and the etymology is much debated, but the point is it used to have a more upbeat, positive connotation, and the naming convention for this sauce is very reminiscent of that used for A1. They're basically trying to say really good sauce, I think, and they do it in just 2 letters or characters. Before we dive into the history, let's take a look at the ingredients of the modern incarnation. What's interesting to me here is that in the previous brown sauces we've seen, they tended to have either dates or apples and oranges as a replacement. Here we have both. There are also raisins, as we saw in the American version of A1, and even lemons. What we don't have is anything particularly brown, other than those dates and raisins. No molasses here, and no caramel for colouring. There's also not much in the way of spice here, unless that's hidden under natural flavouring. It's the least brown and most fruity of all these brown sauces. I think OK sauce emerged after A1, probably in the 1880s and before HP. That might make it the second oldest of all the brown sauces we're going to look at here, but actually, surprisingly, chef sauce could have that accolade instead. We'll come back to that later. The earliest written mention I found to OK sauce is in the catalogue of the 1884 Health Exhibition held in London, wherein we see a list of products George Mason manufactured. Concentrated beef tea, presumably something akin to Bovril, savoury meat lozenges, I'm at a loss to quite imagine what they might be. Invalid turtle soup is also somewhat eye-catching in this list, but the key thing is OK sauce and relish. The following year, 1885, George Mason was exhibiting at the Cookery and Food Exhibition at the Royal Aquarium, London. That's roughly on the site of the Methodist Central Hall today, near Westminster Abbey and the Houses of Parliament. There's a more lavish advert in the catalogue for the exhibition for George Mason & Co.'s Specialities for Invalids. Does that sound familiar? Invalid in this context has pretty much fallen out of use in English today, but in the 19th century it encompassed anyone who was either disabled, injured, or suffering from illness. It was believed that certain foods would be beneficial to people in that state, and from other similar adverts around that time you can see more of those specialities for invalids listed. Essence of beef, concentrated beef tea, those meat lozenges again, and a mention that the products were used in all of the leading hospitals of Great Britain. It's a bit hard to imagine today that the fact a company supplies hospital food would be used as part of a sales pitch. Much of this advertising material is really very reminiscent of the roughly contemporary adverts for Brand & Co.'s products and their A1 sauce. We can see we have specialities for invalids, essence of beef, beef tea, meat lozenges, and a mention of their respective sauces, A1 or OK. As previously mentioned, it seems from the 1890s in America there were 2 competing A1 sauces, one from Brand & Co. and the other from Mason & Co. My guess is that Mason's A1 sauce, as sold in the US in the late 19th and early 20th century, was in fact a rebranded OK sauce. There's another mention of OK sauce in an 1885 magazine called simply Fun. It reads more like an advert and alludes to the fact that the word OK was still a reasonably recent import from America at that time. A few decades later, and a 1922 advert mentions oranges, lemons, raisins and mangoes as the ingredients of OK sauce. All but the mangoes seem to still be present in the modern version. And it was still being sold here in the UK well into the second half of the 20th century. Here's a 1962 advert, for example, at which time they also had a mustard and a mint sauce. The note at the bottom there suggests the brand was still owned by George Mason & Co. at that time. And a mention of it in 1979 refers to it as brown sauce. I think by this time ownership of the brand had transferred to Coleman's of Norfolk, more famous for mustard, who still own it today. As we saw with A1 sauce, OK sauce eventually went into decline here in the UK. However, it continued to enjoy popularity in parts of Asia, I think particularly China, and it is still manufactured here mainly for export. You can buy it in some Asian supermarkets. We should of course talk about the history of what is today's most famous brown sauce, HP. Despite the name coming from the Houses of Parliament, and despite the fact it surely owes something stylistically to its two London-based predecessors, A1 and OK, HP sauce in fact originated in Nottingham. The sauce was first registered as a trademark as the Banquet Sauce by Frederick Gibson Garton in 1890. Garton was based in Nottingham and had a grocer's shop at 15 Milton Street. I believe he took the shop on around 1898 and in that year advertised high-class Stiltons, Leicesters and Cheshires, and a little later Royal Wiltshire bacon, a perfect accompaniment for HP sauce. It's generally reported that sometime in that decade, or possibly even in the 1880s, Garton had devised the recipe for a new sauce, and then, so the story goes, having heard it was being served in the Houses of Parliament, decided to rename it from Banquet Sauce to HP Sauce. I couldn't find any written references to HP sauce dating prior to the early 1900s. The earliest newspaper mentions seem to appear around 1902, like this one. Alas, it seems Frederick Gibson Garton did not get to stay in control of his creation for long. Already by 1903, in adverts, although it was referred to as Garton's HP sauce, it was also noted that the sole proprietors were the Midland Vinegar Company. The story goes that Garton had owed debts to the Midland Vinegar Company, and in order to avoid bankruptcy, he sold the recipe and the rights to the sauce to them. Interestingly, the brown sauce today that is almost certainly the second most popular in Britain, Daddies, was also a creation of Frederick Gibson Garton, and we are led to believe it was also sold to the Midland Vinegar Company around the turn of the century to settle Garton's debts. The earliest written reference I found to it is in 1905, at which time the Midland Vinegar Company were giving away 1,000 bottles of it, which suggests it was likely a new product at that time. Exactly why Garton had chosen to create two sauces, which were almost but not quite the same, is not entirely clear, but notes from an exhibition of 1908, where both sauces were exhibited, suggest Daddies was, from the outset, intended as a budget version of HP. This advert from 1904 suggests that HP sauce contained tomatoes even then. It was described as a blend between a tomato sauce and a Worcester sauce. Tomatoes would have been one of the more expensive ingredients in the sauce, and so Daddies, made without them, would have been a cheaper alternative. Much later in the 20th century, here's a 1956 advert for Daddies' favourite sauce and Daddies tomato ketchup, with a slightly creepy pair of twins, and the advert also shows you what the bottles looked like at that time. Note that the packaging doesn't yet refer to it as a brown sauce. However, I think it's adverts like this which give us a clue as to how the name brown sauce emerged. Ketchup was growing in popularity, particularly post-World War II, with all the American soldiers who had been stationed here, and several of these brown sauce brands also made a ketchup. Shown in pairs like this, it's convenient to think of one as a red sauce and the other as a brown sauce. And indeed, the earliest written reference I could find of Daddies brown sauce is 1960. This isn't official branding from Daddies at this point in time, it appears to just be what one market trader is colloquially referring to it as a convenience to distinguish it from tomato sauce. But you can see how the common usage of the term likely developed from there. There are many more modern brands of brown sauce we could cover here, but one which does have a bit of history and I think provides another interesting example is chef sauce. The Wikipedia page for chef brown sauce suggests early 20th century origins, but I think it may actually be somewhat older than that. For the first few decades of the 20th century, it was made by E. Lazenby, who were later bought by Cross and Blackwell. This very stylish advert in the graphic, dated 1904, describes chef sauce as a rich fruity sauce of recent introduction. It will be found unequalled with all kinds of hot and cold joints, cutlets, curries, etc. That of recent introduction part seems to suggest it was new at that time, but I'm not sure that's really the case. The other sauce there, Harvey's, was something roughly akin to Worcestershire sauce, and quite famous in its day. Byron writes of it in his 1817 poem Beppo. That sauce was created by Peter Harvey, and he gave the recipe to his sister, Elizabeth Lazenby, who started the company E. Lazenby and Son. Intriguingly similar adverts, albeit not as visually appealing, seem to appear as early as 1868. Like the previous advert, we have two sauces side by side, although it could just be a coincidence here, as they seem to be made by two different companies. Harvey's sauce, made by E. Lazenby and Sons, and then chef sauce, with that odd suffix creamy, as also seen in that 1904 advert. At this time, it was made by A. de Place. In an advert of 1879, chef sauce is described as having been created by Alphonse de Place, but now manufactured by Messrs. Snelling and Hale. Once again, we see that word creamy being added on to the name of the sauce. By 1881, it seems to have come under the wing of Dowling and Son of Leadenhall Market. Yet again, we are reminded of just how creamy it is. I think that's a way of saying it's thick, rather than the runnier nature of sauces like Worcestershire. They're still referring to its creation by Alphonse de Place, and there's even a depiction of the chef, as is still the case on modern bottles of chef brown sauce. Up until 1896, chef sauce is still advertised with Dowling and Son as sole proprietors. However, the company of Dowling and Son Limited was wound up in 1898. I couldn't find any specific records linking Dowling and Son with E. Lazenby and Son, so it's not entirely clear what happened here. It's possible E. Lazenby bought the rights to chef sauce from Dowling and Son, or I suppose it's possible they saw that old brand was now defunct and decided to use the name in a new product of their own. Comparing that 1881 ad of the Dowling era with that 1904 ad of the Lazenby era, there are certainly a lot of similarities. The way chef is in quotation marks, the use of the word creamy, and even the logo of the chef himself looks fairly similar. Today, chef is known as an Irish brand of brown sauce, but for a time it coexisted in both Britain and Ireland. This advert of 1931 from an Irish newspaper shows a bottle of chef sauce with the manufacturer listed as E. Lazenby and Son Limited, London and Dublin, and it says that it is made in Dublin. Another advert in 1931 is interesting as it's an early example of the marketing blurb actually mentioning the colour, zest in every drop of this rich brown piquant sauce. Later in that decade, in 1936, the manufacturer listed on the bottle has changed to Chef Products Limited. I suspect that was probably a subsidiary of Cross and Blackwell. Bottles today say bold Irish flavour since 1921, which I assume relates to when it was first manufactured in Ireland, which was not long after Cross and Blackwell acquired E. Lazenby and Son. Let's take a look at the ingredients of the modern version. It contains no molasses, no dates, no tamarind, unless that's hidden under spices or flavouring. As we saw with a couple of those supermarket brands, it looks like apples and oranges are used in place of the dates for the fruity component of the flavour. And like some of those earlier examples, the lack of brown things like dates and molasses means they have to colour it with caramel. By 1955, chef sauce is referred to as a thick fruit and spice sauce, which sounds very much like what we today understand as brown sauce. And as we saw with Daddies, we can see it's being advertised side by side with a ketchup. And once again, by the time of this 1960 advert for a supermarket in Port Talbot, you can see it's being, possibly just colloquially, referred to as Chef Brown Sauce. We should probably draw some conclusions from what has ended up being a far deeper dive into the history of brown sauce than I at first intended. It seems almost all of the brown sauces we've looked at here had 19th century origins, and to at least some extent they emerged independently long before the term brown sauce was ever applied to them collectively. There clearly was at least a bit of imitation between OK and A1, if nothing else just look at the names, and it's tempting to think HP also somewhat followed suit on that with its two-letter moniker. Most of these sauces were born in London, with, somewhat ironically, one of the exceptions being the one that has the Houses of Parliament on it. Instead, that one hails from Nottingham. It's interesting though that all of those sauces of London origin would eventually become better known overseas and go into decline here in the UK. And as I'm sure many of you will be itching to point out in the comments, those two that are still prevalent here in the UK, HP and Daddies, are actually now manufactured abroad. HP in the Netherlands and Daddies, I believe, in Poland. And the two historic brown sauce brands which are still manufactured here, brands A1 and OK Sauce, are only made for the export market now. What a funny old state of affairs. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting. I'm off for a sausage sandwich now. Thanks for watching.